In the brutal, chaotic retreat to the Pusan Perimeter in the summer of 1950, a single black soldier from a segregated infantry regiment stayed behind on a lonely hilltop to cover his unit's withdrawal. For 2 days, the sound of his heavy machine gun was the only thing that stood between his comrades and an entire enemy battalion. Then, there was silence. When American forces retook the hill, they found him frozen in place, his hands still on the trigger, a lone, silent guardian surrounded by the bodies of the enemy. His story was one of impossible courage, a sacrifice that was almost lost to a history that had never learned his name. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. The air in the port of Pusan in the summer of 1950 was a thick, suffocating blanket of humidity, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of fear. For Second Lieutenant David Miller, fresh off a transport ship from the United States, it was the gateway to a war he had only ever studied in the clean, orderly classrooms of West Point. At 23, he was an embodiment of the Academy's highest ideals, a firm believer in duty, honor, and the righteous power of an American army that was, according to the recent, groundbreaking executive order from President Truman, finally on the path to full integration. His first assignment, however, was a stark and immediate confrontation with the stubborn, messy reality that lay beneath those ideals. He was assigned as a platoon leader in a company of the 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the Army's last remaining all-black combat units. The men he was to command were not the eager, fresh-faced cadets he had trained with. They were a mixture of seasoned veterans from the Second World War and new, reluctant draftees, all of them bound by a shared experience of a segregated America that Miller, a product of a comfortable, white, suburban upbringing, could only begin to comprehend. He walked into the company's temporary headquarters, his crisp new uniform and his polished boots a stark contrast to the weary, sweat-stained fatigues of the men around him. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a deep, weary cynicism. He was another white officer, another product of a system that had, for their entire lives, treated them as second-class citizens. It was his new platoon sergeant who greeted him, and in that first meeting, Lieutenant Miller understood the vast, intimidating gulf between his theoretical knowledge and the hard, practical reality of leadership. Sergeant Samuel "Sam" Washington was a man in his late 20s, but he carried himself with the quiet, unshakable gravity of a much older man. He was tall and powerfully built, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were calm, observant, and held a deep, weary wisdom that spoke of a man who had seen the very worst of what human beings could do to each other. He was a veteran of the fighting in Italy during the last war, a man who had earned his stripes not in a classroom, but in the frozen mud and the bloody, close-quarters combat of the Apennine Mountains. "Lieutenant," Sergeant Washington said, his voice a low, steady baritone, his salute a model of crisp, professional respect that was devoid of any hint of subservience. "Welcome to the 24th. In that simple greeting, Miller heard the unspoken challenge. "I will follow your orders, but you will have to earn my respect." Miller, to his credit, understood. He was an idealist, but he was not a fool. He knew that the man standing before him possessed a knowledge of war, of leadership, of survival, that he, with all of his West Point training, could not even begin to fathom. "It's an honor to be here, Sergeant," Miller replied, his voice more earnest than he had intended. "I'm here to learn." It was the smartest thing he could have said. It was the beginning of a bond, a partnership between the young, idealistic white officer and the seasoned, pragmatic black NCO. A bond that would be forged in the crucible of a brutal, unforgiving, and very new war. The uneasy, humid peace of that first week in Pusan was a lie. A few days after Lieutenant Miller's arrival, the North Korean People's Army, NKPA, shattered the fragile stalemate with a massive, coordinated, and brutally effective invasion. The South Korean and American forces, outnumbered and caught completely by surprise, began a desperate, chaotic retreat. The 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the few combat-ready units available, was thrown into the breach, a human dam against a tidal wave of steel and fire. For Lieutenant Miller and his platoon, The war began not with a gradual immersion, but with a violent, head-first plunge into the abyss. Their first taste of combat was a brutal, disorienting firefight in a nameless, mud-choked valley. The NKPA troops were disciplined, well-equipped, and seemingly fearless, their human wave assaults a terrifying, almost unstoppable force. Miller, his mind a jumble of West Point tactics that seemed to have no application in this chaotic, primitive brawl, found himself struggling to maintain control. His orders were hesitant, his commands lost in the deafening roar of battle. He was, for a few, terrifying moments, frozen by the sheer, overwhelming violence of it all. It was Sergeant Sam Washington who held the platoon together. He moved through the firefight with a calm, almost preternatural grace, his presence a steadying anchor in the storm of panic. He did not shout. He did not seem to rush. He simply appeared where he was needed most. A quiet word of encouragement to a terrified private. A quick, precise adjustment to the machine gun's field of fire. A steadying hand on the shoulder of his overwhelmed young lieutenant. "They're trying to flank us on the left, sir," he said to Miller, his voice a low, calm rumble that was somehow audible over the din of battle. "We need to shift the bar to that ridge. Now." Miller, his mind snapping back into focus, gave the order, and under the covering fire of Sergeant Washington's Monet rifle, the platoon was able to shift its defenses, to repel the flanking maneuver, and to hold the line. They took casualties, but they did not break. When the order finally came to pull back, they did so in an orderly, fighting withdrawal, not a panicked rout. That night, in a temporary rain-soaked bivouac, Miller found his sergeant cleaning his rifle with a meticulous, practiced care. "I froze back there, Sergeant," Miller admitted, the words a difficult, humbling confession. Sam Washington did not look up from his work. "Everyone freezes the first time, sir," he said, his voice devoid of any judgment. "The trick is to unfreeze. You did. That's all that matters." In that moment, the formal, rigid barrier between the officer and the enlisted man, between the white commander and the black NCO, began to dissolve. It was replaced by something else, something more profound and more powerful. The simple, unshakable respect between two soldiers who had faced death together and had survived. The bond between Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Washington, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of their first chaotic firefight, was solidified into something unbreakable in the desperate house-to-house fighting for a small, strategically vital village a few days later. The village was a key transportation hub, and the 24th Infantry had been tasked with holding it at all costs, a lonely, defiant island in the middle of the massive, rolling tide of the North Korean advance. Miller's platoon was assigned to the northern edge of the village, their command post a small, sandbagged position in the ruins of what had once been a farmer's cottage. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and relentless. It was a war of grenades and bayonets, of sudden, violent encounters in narrow alleyways and shattered courtyards. For 2 days, the platoon held its ground, their discipline and their courage, a testament to the quiet, steady leadership of their two commanders. Miller, growing in confidence with every passing hour, was proving to be a quick study, his tactical mind beginning to adapt to the fluid, chaotic realities of the battlefield. But he relied, heavily and openly, on the deep, intuitive combat wisdom of his platoon sergeant. It was a partnership, a seamless fusion of Miller's strategic training and Washington's hard-won, bloody experience. On the third day of the battle, the NKPA, frustrated by the platoon's stubborn resistance, decided to decapitate the snake. They unleashed a sudden, massive, and terrifyingly accurate mortar barrage directly on Miller's command post. The world dissolved into a deafening, earth-shaking series of explosions. Miller was thrown across the small, sandbagged enclosure by the concussion of a near-direct hit, his head striking a stone wall with a sickening crack. He was knocked unconscious, his world plunging into a silent, dreamless black. The loss of their lieutenant, at the very moment the NKPA was launching a major, coordinated assault, was a catastrophic blow. The platoon's line began to waver, the men looking around in a state of confused, leaderless panic. The enemy, sensing their advantage, began to press forward, their bugles blaring a triumphant, chilling call to victory. The platoon was about to break, It was about to be overrun. It was Sergeant Sam Washington who stood in the breach. He saw his lieutenant, his friend, lying unconscious and bleeding. He saw the fear and the confusion in the eyes of his men, and in that moment, he became more than just a platoon sergeant. He became the platoon's will to survive. "On me," he roared, his voice a powerful authoritative command that cut through the chaos of the battle. "They are not taking this ground, not today." He did not wait for a response. He rallied a small fire team, his close friend, the cynical and street-smart Corporal Marcus "Philly" Jones, at his side, and in an act of almost suicidal, audacious bravery, he led them in a ferocious, head-on counterattack. He charged directly into the teeth of the enemy assault, his Monet rifle a blur of controlled, deadly fire. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of his attack stunned the North Koreans. They had been expecting a panicked retreat. They were met instead with a wall of disciplined, furious violence. The momentum of their assault was broken. They faltered, and then, as the rest of the platoon, inspired by their sergeant's incredible courage, rallied and joined the fight, they began to fall back. The counterattack was a success. The line was held. Sam Washington, his face a mask of grim, focused determination, personally carried his wounded lieutenant back to the relative safety of a makeshift aid station. Miller was alive, his head wound, serious but not fatal. Sam had not just saved his platoon, he had saved his commander's life. When Miller regained consciousness a few hours later, the first face he saw was that of his platoon sergeant. The bond between them was no longer just one of mutual respect. It was one of a shared, profound, and blood-soaked debt. A debt that could only be understood by men who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death together. The small, hard-won victories were, in the grand, strategic scheme of the war, meaningless. The American and South Korean forces were in a state of full, desperate retreat. The North Korean army, a seemingly unstoppable juggernaut, was pushing them further and further down the Korean peninsula into a small, shrinking pocket of land around the port city of Pusan. The order came down from the highest levels of command, a single, stark, and brutal command, a general bug-out. It was not a retreat in the orderly, tactical sense of the word. It was a desperate, chaotic, and often panicked flight, a race against time to establish a final, defensible line before the entire Allied army was pushed into the sea. For the men of Lieutenant Miller's company, the order meant that they were once again being thrown into the breach. Their new mission was a classic, and almost always suicidal. Delaying action, they were ordered to occupy and hold a piece of high ground, a lonely, barren, and strategically vital piece of rock and dirt designated on the maps as Hill 209. The hill was not their new home. It was their sacrificial altar. It commanded a perfect, sweeping view of the main valley road, the primary artery of the great American retreat. Their job was to stand on that hill and to hold it for as long as possible, to be the shield, the unbreachable wall that would buy the precious, vital hours that the thousands of other American soldiers streaming down that road needed to escape. They were the rear guard, the forlorn hope, the men who were being asked to die so that others might live. They dug in on the exposed rocky slopes of Hill 209, their entrenching tools scraping at the hard, unyielding earth. The position was a tactical nightmare. It offered little cover, and it was exposed to enemy fire from three sides. As they worked, they could see the grim, terrible spectacle of the great bug-out unfolding in the valley below. It was a river of men and machines, a disorganized, desperate exodus. And behind them, they could see the dust clouds of the advancing North Korean army, a relentless, predatory wolf pack closing in on the scattered, fleeing herd. The mood among the men of the company was a mixture of grim resolve and a quiet, fatalistic despair. They all knew the math of their situation. They were a single, under-strength rifle company with limited ammunition and no artillery support against what was likely to be an entire enemy battalion. They were not here to win. They were here to die. But they were determined to die well. The North Korean assault began just after noon. They were not fools. They knew the strategic importance of the hill, and they knew that the small, isolated American force holding it was the only thing standing between them and the complete and total annihilation of the retreating American column in the valley. They threw everything they had at the hill. The first wave was a human wave, a mass of screaming, bugle-blowing infantrymen charging up the exposed slope, their bayonets glinting in the harsh summer sun. The men of Miller's company held their fire, their discipline a testament to the hard-won experience of the past few weeks. They waited until the enemy was almost on top of them, and then they opened fire. The entire hilltop erupted in a deafening, furious roar of automatic weapons fire. The human wave was shattered, cut to pieces by the disciplined, interlocking fields of fire that the American NCOs, men like Sergeant Sam Washington, had so skillfully established. But the North Koreans were relentless. The first wave was followed by a second, and then a third. The fighting was savage, brutal, and fought at close quarters. The slopes of Hill 209 became a charnel house, a landscape of death and dying. The Americans took terrible, devastating casualties, but they held through the long, bloody afternoon and into the dark, terrifying night. They held the line. And at the very center of that line, the anchor of their entire defense, was the machine gun squad commanded by Sergeant Sam Washington. His gun, a standard air-cooled .30 caliber, was positioned at the key tactical choke point, the one spot that commanded the main approach to the summit. And all through the night, the steady, rhythmic, and utterly defiant roar of his gun was the sound of their survival. The dawn of the second day on Hill 209 broke over a landscape of almost unimaginable carnage. The slopes of the hill were a grotesque, silent testament to the ferocity of the night's fighting. The bodies of the dead, both American and North Korean, lying in tangled, frozen tableaus of death. The survivors of Lieutenant Miller's company were exhausted. Their ammunition was critically low, and their numbers had been cut by more than half. But they were still alive. They had held the hill. They had done the impossible. But as the first gray light of the morning spread across the valley, they saw a new and far more terrifying enemy. During the night, the North Koreans had brought up their armor. A single Soviet-made T-34 tank, a formidable, iron-skinned beast, was positioned at the base of the hill, its long, menacing cannon pointed directly at the American positions. The company had no effective anti-tank weapons. They were riflemen, and their bullets would be as useless as pebbles against the tank's thick, sloped armor. The tank was a death sentence, a patient, steel predator that could, and would, take them apart, piece by bloody piece. At its leisure, the tank's first shot was a demonstration of its terrible, methodical power. It did not fire at a random position. It fired at the most critical, most vital, and most dangerous point of the entire American defense, the machine gun nest commanded by Sergeant Sam Washington. The shell, a massive, high-explosive round, screamed across the short distance and struck the sandbagged emplacement with a catastrophic, deafening roar. The entire position was obliterated, a geyser of earth, sandbags, and shattered human bodies thrown into the air. The .30 caliber machine gun, the weapon that had been the anchor of their defense for the past 24 hours, was a twisted, smoking wreck. And the men who had manned it were gone. The loss of the machine gun was a mortal blow. The fragile, hard-won morale of the surviving Americans shattered. Without that weapon, the hill was indefensible. The North Koreans knew it. They began to mass at the base of the hill for a final, overwhelming assault, their confidence renewed, their victory now a certainty. The American position was about to collapse. The massacre was about to begin. It was in this moment of absolute, hopeless despair that Sergeant Sam Washington performed an act of such audacious, almost insane bravery that it would become the stuff of legend. He ran to Lieutenant Miller's command post, his face a mask of grim, focused intensity. "Sir," he said, his voice calm and steady, as if he were discussing a routine training exercise. "There's a 50 cal on the Jeep." Miller stared at him, his exhausted, shell-shocked mind struggling to process the words. The Jeep, one of their supply Jeeps, had been disabled by mortar fire at the very base of the hill during their initial occupation of the position. And on its pintle mount, a weapon that was not standard issue for a rifle company, but that some enterprising supply sergeant had clearly acquired, was a massive, air-cooled M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun. A weapon that was powerful enough to chew through the armor of a light personnel carrier, a weapon that fired a bullet the size of a man's thumb, a weapon that could, if they could get to it, turn the tide of the entire battle. But the jeep was at the bottom of the hill, in the open, in the direct line of fire of every North Korean soldier who was now preparing for the final assault. To try to get to it was not just a risk, it was a suicide mission. "It's impossible, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They'll cut you to pieces before you get halfway there." "Maybe," Sam replied, a strange, cold, and almost feral smile on his face. "But it's the only chance we've got." He did not wait for an order. He turned to his friend, Corporal Philly Jones. "You with me, Philly?" he asked, his voice a quiet challenge. Philly, the cynical, street-smart kid from Philadelphia, looked at the jeep, at the massing North Korean infantry, at the cold, impassive face of the T-34 tank, and then he looked at his sergeant, at the man who had been his anchor of sanity in this mad, insane world. He let out a short, harsh, and utterly fearless laugh. "Hell, Sarge," he said. "I ain't got nothing better to do." And under the cover of a few pathetic smoke grenades, the two men, in an act of pure, distilled, and almost unbelievable courage, began to run down the hill. The run down the hill was a mad, desperate, and seemingly eternal sprint through a hailstorm of enemy fire. Bullets snapped and whizzed past their heads, chewing up the dirt at their feet. Mortar shells walked their way across the slope, each explosion a deafening, earth-shaking concussion that threatened to tear them apart. But Sam and Philly ran with the desperate, focused energy of men who had already accepted their own deaths. They were not running to survive. They were running to complete a mission. They reached the disabled jeep, a small, battered island of relative safety in a sea of fire. The .50 caliber machine gun was still there, its long, heavy barrel pointing accusingly at the sky. The weapon, with its tripod and its ammunition boxes, weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. It was not a weapon that was meant to be moved by two men in the middle of a firefight, but Sam and Philly were fueled by a strength that was not just physical. It was the strength of desperation, of a righteous, all-consuming fury. They worked with a frantic, coordinated efficiency, their hands a blur of motion as they stripped the massive weapon from its mount. They were not just two soldiers, they were a single, functioning organism, their movements intuitive, their purpose singular. They began the torturous, almost impossible journey back up the hill. They did not run. They crawled, they dragged, they pushed, they pulled, their bodies screaming in protest, their lungs burning with a fire that was more intense than any explosion. They were hauling not just a weapon, but the entire, crushing weight of their company's survival on their backs. And somehow, through some miracle of will, of courage, of a sheer, stubborn refusal to die, they made it. They collapsed at the summit, their bodies a wreck, their lungs heaving, but at their feet was the prize, the big, beautiful, and brutally effective .50 caliber machine gun. They set it up in a new, dangerously exposed position, a shallow crater that offered a perfect field of fire, but almost no cover. And then, Sam Washington opened fire. The sound of the .50 caliber was not the sharp, rhythmic chatter of the smaller .30 caliber. It was a deep, thunderous, and terrifying roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated power. Each massive, half-inch round was a small explosive cannon shell, and the effect on the massing North Korean infantry was devastating. The gun did not just kill, it annihilated, its stream of tracers a fiery, vengeful scythe that tore through the enemy's ranks, shredding bodies and shattering morale. The great North Korean assault, which had been on the very verge of a triumphant, final charge, was stalled, its momentum broken by the single, defiant, and thunderous voice of Sam Washington's gun. But their victory was a fleeting, temporary thing. They had bought themselves a few more precious minutes of life, but they had not changed the fundamental, brutal math of their situation. And it was in that moment, as Sam was feeding a new, heavy belt of ammunition into his gun, that the final, terrible order came down the line. The company was to retreat. The rest of the regiment, the thousands of men in the valley below, had cleared the danger zone. The company's mission, their suicidal, sacrificial delaying action, was complete. They were to fall back, to save themselves. Lieutenant Miller crawled over to Sam's position, his face a mask of grief, of gratitude, and of a terrible, agonizing conflict. "We're pulling out, Sergeant," he said, his voice choked with an emotion he could not control. The order is to retreat." Sam did not stop firing. He stitched a long, devastating burst into a group of enemy soldiers who were trying to set up a mortar. "You go, sir," he said, his voice calm, his eyes never leaving the battlefield in front of him. "You take the men, and you go." "I'm not leaving you, Sam," Miller said, his voice a desperate plea. Sam finally stopped firing. He turned and looked at his young lieutenant, and his expression was not one of fear or of anger, but of a strange, weary, and almost paternal patience. "This is not a choice, Lieutenant," he said, his voice quiet, but with a finality that was absolute. "It's a calculation. We all run, they swarm this hill, and they shoot us in the back. They'll massacre us before we get 100 yards. But if one man stays on this gun, if one man keeps their heads down for just a few more minutes, the rest of you might just make it." He looked at Miller, and in his eyes, the young officer saw the full, terrible, and heroic weight of a soldier's duty. "My life," Sam said, "for the rest of the company." It's good math. The final moments on the summit of Hill 209 were a blur of desperate, heartbreaking arguments and a single, unshakable, and heroic resolve. Lieutenant Miller, his face a mask of anguish, refused the order. "I will not leave my platoon sergeant behind," he said, his voice a mixture of a commander's authority and a friend's desperate plea. "We'll all stay. We'll fight to the last man, together." "No, sir," Sam Washington replied, his voice calm, but with an iron finality that was more powerful than any rank. "Your job is to get these men out of here. That is your mission. My mission is to give you the time to do it." He turned to Corporal Philly Jones, who was crouched beside him, his face a mess of tears and a furious, helpless anger. "Philly," Sam said, his voice softening for the first time. "You go with him. You get them home." "I ain't leaving you, Sam," Philly sobbed, his words a choked, ragged protest. "I ain't leaving you." Sam reached out and grabbed his friend by the front of his fatigue jacket, his grip like a steel vise. He pulled him close, their faces just inches apart. "Yes, you are," he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "That is an order, Corporal. You are going to get up, you are going to get these men down this hill, and you are going to live. You are going to live, and you are going to tell them what we did here. You understand me?" Philly, his body shaking with a grief too profound for words, could only nod. Sam released him. He gave his friend a final, hard, and loving pat on the shoulder. Then he turned to his lieutenant. He did not say another word. He simply gave Miller a long, steady look. It was a look that transcended rank, that transcended race, that transcended everything except the profound, unspoken bond between two soldiers who had faced death together. It was a look of mutual, absolute, and heartbreaking respect. And then, he turned back to his gun. Lieutenant Miller, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, gave the most difficult, the most painful, and the most courageous order of his young life. "Retreat," he said, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "Fall back. Now." The retreat down the far slope of Hill 209 was not a flight. It was a ghost-like procession of exhausted, wounded, and heartbroken survivors. They did not run. They stumbled, they crawled, they half-carried each other, their movements a slow, agonizing ballet of survival. And as they made their way down into the relative safety of the wooded valley below, the soundtrack to their escape, the anthem of their survival, was the single, defiant, and continuous roar of Sergeant Sam Washington's .50 caliber machine gun. The sound was a lifeline. It was a thunderous, beautiful, and terrible symphony of courage. They could hear it chewing through the ranks of the enemy, its deep, concussive roar a testament to the ferocity of the man who was wielding it. They could hear the answering fire of the North Koreans, the sharp, angry crack of their rifles, the chatter of their own machine guns, all of it focused on that one, single, solitary position at the summit of the hill. But through it all, the sound of Sam's gun never faltered. It was a steady, rhythmic, and seemingly inexhaustible roar of defiance. It was the sound of a promise being kept. It was the sound of a man trading his own life, second by precious second, for theirs. They reached the bottom of the valley. They were safe. They were alive. And still, they could hear the gun. It was the sound of a single, solitary lion, holding off an entire pack of wolves. It was the sound of a hero. And then, after what felt like an eternity that had been bought for them with the blood of their sergeant, the gun fell silent. The sudden, absolute silence that descended over the valley was more profound, more deafening, and more heartbreaking than any explosion had ever been. 2 days later, the tide of the war had turned. The great, desperate retreat was over. The American and South Korean forces had established a new, solid, and unbreachable defensive line around the port of Pusan. The Pusan Perimeter, as it would come to be known, was the line in the sand. The order was no longer to retreat. It was to counterattack. It was to reclaim the ground that had been paid for with so much blood. Captain Frank Thorne, a grizzled, battle-hardened veteran of the Normandy campaign, was given his orders. His company was to lead the assault, to retake a series of strategic hills that had been lost during the bug-out. The first objective on his list was a lonely, barren piece of high ground designated on the maps as Hill 209. Thorne was a man who had seen the very worst of war. He had fought his way across the bloody hedgerows of France, had survived the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge. He was a tough, no-nonsense, and deeply respected combat officer, a man who thought he had seen every possible variation of human courage and human depravity that the war had to offer. As he briefed his men for the assault, he was approached by a young, fresh-faced lieutenant from the 24th Infantry, a man named Miller, whose company had been the last to hold the hill. Miller's face was a mask of grief and a strange, fierce pride. He told Thorne the story. He told him about the retreat, about the impossible odds, about the sergeant who had stayed behind. He told him about the sound of the .50 caliber machine gun, the sound that had been the only reason his men were still alive. His name was Sergeant Sam Washington, Miller said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not conceal. He was the best soldier I have ever known. Thorne listened, his expression unreadable. He had heard 100 stories like this in his long, bloody career. The fog of war was thick with legends, with battlefield myths, with stories of heroism that were often exaggerated in the telling. He was a man who believed only what he could see with his own eyes. But there was something in the young lieutenant's voice, a raw, undeniable sincerity, that made him pause. "We'll find him, Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice a gruff, non-committal promise. And then, he gave the order to attack. The fight for Hill 209 was not the brutal, bloody affair that Captain Thorne had been expecting. The North Korean forces, who had paid such a heavy price to take the hill 2 days earlier, seemed to have lost their stomach for the fight. Their resistance was sporadic, disorganized, and they fell back quickly in the face of the determined American assault. It was as if the hill itself was haunted, a place of such terrible memory that even the victors did not wish to remain there. Thorne and his men reached the summit just after noon, and the scene they found there was one that would be seared into the memory of every man who witnessed it. It was a scene of almost biblical, almost mythological carnage. The area around a single makeshift machine gun nest was a desolate, cratered moonscape, and in a wide, semicircular arc around that nest lay the bodies of the enemy. Not a dozen, not 50, but nearly 100 North Korean soldiers, their bodies a testament to the terrible, focused, and unimaginable fury of a single, well-placed gun. And there, at the center of it all, was the gunner. He was slumped forward over the massive, silent bulk of the .50 caliber machine gun. He was a black American sergeant. His fatigue jacket was riddled with dozens of bullet holes, but his hands, in a final, defiant act of will, were still locked onto the trigger grips of his weapon. He was frozen in place, a silent, solitary guardian, a warrior who had died, but had not surrendered his post. Captain Frank Thorne, the man who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, the man who had fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the man who thought he had seen it all, stood before the silent, frozen figure of Sergeant Sam Washington, and he was struck silent and humbled. He had never, in his entire, bloody career, seen anything like it. This was not just courage, this was something more. It was a work of art, a terrible, beautiful, and perfect sculpture of a soldier's duty. He took off his helmet, a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect. The rumors were not myths. The young lieutenant had not been exaggerating. He was standing in the presence of a giant. Captain Frank Thorne was a man who understood the fragile, ephemeral nature of battlefield heroism. He knew that stories of incredible courage, if not properly and officially documented, had a way of dissolving into the fog of war, of becoming mere folklore, their power and their truth lost to the cold, impersonal machinery of military bureaucracy. He knew that the story of the man in front of him, of Sergeant Sam Washington, was a story that was too important, too profound, to be lost. He was determined to be its witness, its champion, its guarantor. He immediately declared the summit of Hill 209 a protected site. He allowed no one to touch the scene. He called for the Army's combat photographers, ordering them to document everything, to capture the full, terrible, and heroic scope of what had happened there. He wanted the world to see what he was seeing: the single lone machine gun nest, the staggering, almost unbelievable number of enemy dead, and the solitary, defiant figure of the American sergeant, his hand still locked on the trigger of his weapon. He knew that a picture would tell a story that 1,000 words in a report never could. Only after the scene had been fully and meticulously documented did he allow his men to respectfully, and with a kind of reverent awe, remove the body of Sergeant Washington. Thorne personally supervised the process, ensuring that the man who had died with such incredible dignity was treated with that same dignity in his final journey off the hill. He found the sergeant's dog tags, and he held them in his hand, the simple, stamped piece of metal, a tangible link to the man's identity. Washington, Samuel. It was a good, strong American name. That evening, back at the company's command post, Captain Thorne did something he rarely did. He personally wrote the commendation report. He did not delegate it to a junior officer. He knew that this story had to be told in his own words, with the full weight of his own, unimpeachable combat record behind it. He wrote with a simple, direct, and powerful clarity. He described the scene on the hilltop. He described the evidence of the overwhelming odds. And he described the final, heroic posture of the soldier who had faced them. He used words that he did not often use in his official reports. Words like extraordinary, unprecedented, and valor. He recommended Sergeant Samuel Washington for the nation's highest award for military heroism, the Medal of Honor. He knew that his recommendation, particularly for a black soldier from a segregated unit that was already facing a storm of unfair criticism from the high command, would be a difficult, uphill battle. But he was Frank Thorne. He was a decorated veteran of 2 wars. His voice carried weight, and he was prepared to use every ounce of his authority, of his reputation, to ensure that this soldier, this hero, received the honor he had so clearly and so dearly earned. A few days later, he found Lieutenant Miller and Corporal Jones in a rear area, their platoon being refitted and reinforced after the terrible losses they had sustained. He found them sitting on the hood of a jeep, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and the hollow, haunted look of survivors. He walked up to them, and he handed Miller the dog tags. "I found your sergeant, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low, gruff rumble. Miller took the tags, his hand trembling. "Is he?" he began, his voice unable to finish the question. "He's a hero," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the young officer's grief with a simple, absolute certainty. "He's a hero, and I'll make damn sure the whole world knows it." He told them what he had seen on the hill. He told them about the report he had filed. He told them that the story of what Sam Washington had done would not be forgotten. In that moment, for the 2 young, grieving survivors of the platoon, a small, fragile glimmer of light pierced the overwhelming darkness of their loss. Their sergeant, their friend, their savior, was not just a casualty of a brutal, forgotten battle. His sacrifice had been seen, it had been witnessed, and it would be honored. The legacy of the Tiger of Hill 209, as he would come to be known, was now secure. His story was no longer just a painful memory shared by the few men whose lives he had saved. It was about to become a permanent and powerful part of American history.